Chapter 28, Section 5, Rebuilding European Economies. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, Europe was in terrible shape after the war. One reporter described Warsaw, Poland as rows of roofless, doorless, windowless walls that looked like they'd been dug out of the earth by an army of archaeologists. Times were hard in Britain, too, which was nearly bankrupt after the war. Conditions worsened during the frigid winter of 1946-1947, when Britain faced grave shortages of food, fuel, and electricity. In Italy, France, and many other European countries, conditions were even worse. European nations face widespread devastation. The challenge of rebuilding war-torn Europe was enormous. Across the continent, governments and economies barely functioned. Warfare had devastated numerous cities, leaving many of the inhabitants homeless and unemployed. It had destroyed schools, hospitals, churches, and factories, knocked out communication systems, and ruined ports. It left many roads, bridges, and railroad lines heavily damaged. Without a usable transportation system, carrying raw materials to factories and crops and goods to market was impossible. In the hardest-hit areas, deadly diseases like tuberculosis spread rapidly. U.S. leaders feared that conditions in Europe would give rise to political and social unrest. In some countries, workers staged strikes and demonstrations to protest the hardships of daily life. Some poor and jobless people began to look to communist ideology for answers to their problems. Many recalled how local communist groups had resisted the Nazis' rise to power. In these stressful and difficult times, communism quickly gained appeal in Italy and France. The U.S. provides aid through the Marshall Plan. As with Greece and Turkey, Truman reasoned that rebuilding shattered economies and supporting freely elected governments would be the best way to stop communism from spreading. Truman also knew that, as the strongest economic power in the world, the United States had the money and resources to help Europe rebuild. With these factors in mind, Truman and his advisors developed a plan for European recovery. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced the plan in a speech at Harvard University. There he described the plan as both high-minded and practical. It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. George Marshall, June 5, 1947. This recovery plan became known as the Marshall Plan. It offered all European nations, including the Soviet Union, generous funding to rebuild their economies as long as the money was spent on goods made in the United States. The plan appealed to many U.S. leaders. Those who supported it hoped to promote democracy in Europe and oppose the spread of communism, thus reinforcing the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment. They also wanted to open markets for American goods and further boost the economy of the United States. Some Republicans in Congress did initially oppose what they called a New Deal for Europe. However, the Marshall Plan gained wide support in the spring of 1948 after lawmakers learned that the Communist Party had taken control of Czechoslovakia. That year, Congress approved over $13 billion in aid, to be spent over a 4-year period from 1948 to 1952. This aid would play a crucial role in stimulating economic growth and prosperity in Western Europe. The USSR responds with the Molotov Plan. Although the United States painted the Marshall Plan as a generous effort to aid European recovery, Soviet leaders questioned its motives. They believed that its real purpose was to create a U.S. sphere of influence in Western Europe. Stalin viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to interfere in Soviet internal affairs. The Soviets knew that to receive aid they would have to share information about their economy and resources with the United States, and even allow U.S. inspectors into the country to see how the aid was being used. Stalin also felt that his government, in accepting American aid, would have to cede some control over economic planning and decision-making. For these reasons, the Soviet Union chose not to take part. Czechoslovakia, however, was eager to join the Marshall Plan. Czech leaders met with Stalin in Moscow to get his approval. They explained that 2/3 of the raw materials Czechoslovakia needed for manufacturing came from Western countries. But Stalin denied their request, saying that they could not cooperate in an action aimed at isolating the Soviet Union. In the end, at the urging of the Soviets, no Eastern European nations took part in the Marshall Plan. To compete with its rival in 1949, the Soviet Union created the Molotov Plan, named after Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. This plan was designed to aid economic recovery in Eastern Europe. To do this, it established a new organization, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Initially, ComCon's main task was to create two-way trade agreements between the Soviet Union and other ComCon members. In the 1950s, ComCons attempted more ambitious projects. It worked to integrate Eastern European economies by encouraging member states to specialize in goods and services not produced in other states. A Cold War has begun. By 1949, the wartime alliance of the United States and the Soviet Union had turned into a relationship of mutual distrust and suspicion. Each side held a different vision for the world. The United States wanted to promote the growth of independent capitalist democracies, while the Soviet Union wanted to surround itself with communist states that followed its lead. The two superpowers had clashed over communist takeovers in Eastern Europe. They had confronted each other over Iran and, less directly, in Greece and Turkey. They had argued over atomic energy and plans for post-war economic recovery in Europe. Although the hostility between the two superpowers and their allies often heated up, it never led to armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was for that reason that this post-war struggle became known as the Cold War. During the Cold War, Europe and much of the world divided into two hostile camps. The United States and the Soviet Union waged a war of words, using propaganda, diplomacy, economic and military aid, and espionage as weapons. Each superpower viewed its own motives and actions as right and good, while it cast its rivals' behavior in a bad light. As the conflict grew, compromise and cooperation became greater challenges. These problems worsened with the development of atomic weapons, which in turn raised fears of a deadly arms race. Both sides knew that if the Cold War turned hot, it could result in another world war, potentially the most destructive in human history.